Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to do something a little different. Instead of doing my normal videos, which is because right now I'm working on the quantum hermeticism series. Instead of doing that this week, we're going to what I'm going to do is basically give a review of a book I've read, and this book is very it's not technical. It's pretty easy to understand, but it's also you got to understand some aspects of quantum theory and evolutionary theory and basic ideas of philosophy of mind and all that stuff. So we're gonna basically go over what I thought of the book, and we're gonna go over each chapter of the book, and as well to kind of get the larger context of what it's trying to get at. And I do think the book overall, I think, was very well written. I do respect Donald Hoffman. I respect his work. I don't necessarily agree with everything he has to say, but I do agree with him with his fundamental premise, which is simply that consciousness is fundamental to reality. And so that's kind of the whole, that's kind of the whole premise of my whole channel is Christian idealism, which is under idealism, consciousness is fundamental. And so that's kind of, so I would agree with him there regarding the fundamental nature of consciousness. And so we're going to go over basically what he has to say in the book. So it says in the introduction, he says, challenge that this book would challenge leading scientific theories that claim that our senses report back objective reality. Cognitive science Donald Hoffman argues that while we should take our perceptions seriously, we should not take them literally. So basically, the basic idea behind his book is that what we see as physical objects in space-time, that is not the objective reality that exists out there, so to speak. And that there's a more deeper, there's a kind of like a noumena that exists beyond our perceptions. And this noumena is the objective reality, and it turns out that that objective reality is not space-time matter, but rather Donald Hoffman in his book argues that it's conscious agents that are the objective reality. And so the first chapter pretty much goes over the mystery of consciousness. And the mystery of consciousness is basically, we talked about this before in our channel, which is the hard problem. And typically, most neuroscientists will go with what's called the astonishing hypothesis, which is that if consciousness arises from the interactions of a pack of neurons, then splitting that pack of the interactions can split consciousness. So the basic idea, or the basic theory that Donald Hoffman is criticizing here would be the thesis of physicalism, which is that consciousness is either reduces to the brain or is strongly emergent from the brain. And so under the physicalist hypothesis, you basically say that neurons and space-time and all the stuff and physical stuff is the fundamental nature of reality, and then consciousness kind of emerges from that fundamental physical stuff. And so that's what we would call physicalism. So the basic idea here is that Donald Hoffman is critiquing that thesis, that belief system. And so then he goes over basically, why this consciousness is fundamentally a problem for physicalism. And he says, quote, for any theory that proposes that brain activity causes conscious experience, we want mathematical laws or principles that say precisely which brain activities cause the conscious experience of tasting basil, precisely why this activity does not cause the experience of, let's say, hearing a siren, and precisely how this activity must change to transform the experience from tasting basil to, say, tasting rosemary. These laws or principles must apply across species, or else precisely why different species require different laws. No such laws, indeed no plausible ideas, have ever been proposed. And so the reason why Donald Hoffman brings this up is basically in science, any theory we come up with to explain phenomena, there's certain laws that we need to invoke to try to explain phenomena. Like, for example, in classical physics, we have the laws of motion, right? Newton's, great fundamental laws. And in special relativity, we have Einstein's equations to describe, the bending of space-time and all that stuff. And in quantum mechanics, we have things like the Schrödinger equation, which explain, how quantum particles behave. But when it comes to consciousness, and when it comes to, neuroscience seems to only, it doesn't really have their own laws, right? Like, neuroscience is only investigating the functional rule of the brain, like the brain does this or that, but it doesn't have any laws to describe how consciousness could arise from that. And in fact, there literally is nothing in neuroscience. There's no scientific theory of consciousness that could explain how this happens. And the best theories we have in neuroscience happen to just be, again, just functional things, like how does this work, or how does neurosynapses work. Like, that's fine. You can use functional explanations, but those functional explanations don't explain how consciousness could arise from that. In fact, if you're going to propose, for example, that consciousness is strongly emergent from the brain, you're going to need to propose some laws of how that takes place, some scientific laws that we can predict, like, okay, this brain activity corresponds to this conscious experience, and the reason why this causes this conscious experience is because of this law. Well, it turns out there are no laws that have been proposed that actually do that. So that's basically what Donald Hoffman calls, a black hole, or the black box of science, which is basically we can't explain consciousness. And so now the question is, okay, if we can't explain consciousness in terms of, the brain, then maybe we've made a mistake. And that's precisely what Donald Hoffman gets into, is that we've made a mistake. We have assumed that physical stuff in space-time is fundamental, and that somehow consciousness emerges from that, when really what we should be really doing is looking at it from the other perspective, which is that consciousness is fundamental, and then space-time emerges from that. So then he goes into chapter 2, and he talks about the evolution of beauty, and how our perception of beauty is kind of changes over time, and all that good stuff. I'm not going to go over too much here, because I think, I don't want to go over everything that he goes over in the book, because I think people should read the book. But precisely in chapter 2, he talks about beauty and how the evolution of beauty occurred, and so on and so forth. And so basically his basic premise in the book is that if our senses evolved and were shaped by natural selection, the space-time and physical objects like beauty reside in the eye of the beholder. And so the basic idea, as he argues in chapter 2, is that things like beauty only exist within our perceptions. Like, when we see something beautiful, it's because we see it within the eye of the beholder. In other words, it's totally subjective. And so that's basically what the idea is. So now he gets into what's in chapter 3, which is reality. So reality has to do with, he basically talks about, again, just kind of how the eye works, and how there's, in fact, he says that there's 130 million photoreceptors within our eyes that kind of capture reality. And so then he talks about the distinction between what's called the phenomena and the noumena distinction, which is famously given by Immanuel Kant. And basically the idea is that what we perceive is not really the objective reality, so to speak. And he talks about that in chapter 2. Chapter 3, he talks about sensory perceptions, and how basically he basically says, quote, according to the standard accounts of evolution, although fitness payoffs depends on the true state of the world, they also depend on the organism, its state, its action, and its competition. So basically, he basically says that in this chapter, that all of the current theories of evolution, they assume that what we perceive is the objective reality out there. And again, he argues that this is actually not the case in his book. And so what he derives is what's called the fitness beats truth theorem. And the fitness beats truth theorem, to give kind of a summary of it, is basically the idea that in evolution, species that see fitness survive better than species that see truth. So species that see truth actually go extinct, whereas species that see fitness, or in other words, see what gives them survival, they're going to survive better if they see only fitness rather than the truth. And so the reason why is because of what's called this fitness beats truth theorem, and he basically derives his theorem from these simulations that he does in his laboratories, and I'm not going to get into the details here, but basically the idea is, quote, even when perception and action have co-evolved for hundreds of generations, truth did not appear. Players in the last generation saw the fitness of resources, but their true qualities only on the off chance that fitness points track which structures could truth appear. And so basically the idea is that
These simulations do not constitute a proof, but they do constitute the extinction of truth, and evolutionary games cannot be pinned on faulty assumptions. Instead, truth goes extinct because it hunts reality rather than fitness, like a chess player who hunts rocks rather than the king. So basically, again, the idea here is that fitness is always going to be truth, and so if that's the case, then he says, quote, the probability that fitness payoffs reflect any structure in the world plummets to zero as the complexity of the world and perception soars. So basically the idea is, what he's saying here is the probability that evolution would actually give us the perceptions to perceive true reality is zero. So there basically is no chance that evolution would allow for any complex creature to actually see truth. Rather, what we're seeing is what's called fitness. So he talks about this in more detail in the book, so I'm not going to go into much. Now, my favorite chapter is actually chapter 4. And the reason why chapter 4 is my favorite chapter in the book is because it really changes the perspective. Like, it really gets you to think about the outside world and what objective reality is. Now, this chapter, I'm not going to lie, this chapter really got me thinking really hard about objective reality and what objective reality is, and whether or not my perceptions actually do correspond to that. And I'm telling you right now, this chapter is probably my favorite. It is my favorite one, but he goes into basically that, quote, the FBT theorem, or the fitness be true theorem, says the chance of my perceptions are vertical, that they perceive some structure of objective reality, is less than my chance to win the lottery. This chance goes to zero as the world and my perceptions grow more complex, even if my perceptual systems are highly plastic and can change quickly as needed. So basically, he does admit that this theorem is very counterintuitive, right? Because it doesn't seem like evolution would do that, but that's, when we look into evolutionary game theory, that seems to be what's going on. So he says, quote, each perceptual system is a user interface like the desktop on a laptop. So basically, the idea is that he uses the analogy of a desktop in the book, and he also talks about this in his lectures as well. But basically, the idea is that what we perceive is not objective reality. Rather, what we see is like a desktop. It's a user interface for our perceptions. In the same way that when we use a computer, we're not actually seeing the file itself in the computer, but rather what we're seeing is a user interface so that we can kind of, interact with it. Because here's the thing, if there wasn't a user interface on a computer, then we couldn't actually access our files. In the same way, if there was no user interface for reality, then we couldn't actually survive in reality. So that's the basic idea, is that our perceptions of the world, like space, time, matter, and all that stuff, is basically, he calls it actually a useful fiction, where literally our perceptions of physical space-time are a literal fiction. They don't actually exist out there. Okay, what it is basically it's a fitness space. It's a useful fiction to help us survive in the world, essentially. So the world isn't actually space, time, and matter. We perceive it that way because that's what evolution gives us through fitness. But in reality, what exists beyond our perceptions, or what exists out there, so to speak, is not physical reality, but rather it's conscious agents. So that's basically the idea. In this chapter, he goes over that and how literally space, time, matter basically don't really exist. Like in the literal sense, they don't actually exist in objective reality. They are basically literally just a useful fiction to help us survive in the world. And that seems very counterintuitive, right? Because it's like, well, wait a minute here. If objective reality is not space and time, then what happens when I don't look at something? Well, the truth case is that when you're not looking at something, it doesn't really exist in its physical form. Now, you could interact with it, right? You can close your eyes and touch it, but what you're touching is not actually a physical thing. It's probably something radically different. And that's kind of the whole point, is space-time and matter and physical objects, they are not the actual reality. They're actually just
useful fictions, essentially.
So this has very counterintuitive implications, but that's basically what the theorem implies. That's what the fitness beats truth theorem implies. It implies that what we perceive as reality is basically just fitness. It's not actually reality, it's just fitness. And so that's kind of the idea. So now I'm going to go into chapter 6. Okay. So chapter 6 basically goes into a lot of physics, and so basically this is what he says in the book. He says, quote, ITP predicts, or he presents a theory. It's called user interface perception. Of his theory of perception basically says ITPT predicts that space-time does not exist unperceived. My space-time is the desktop of my interference. Your space-time is your desktop. Space-times vary from observer to observer, and some properties of space-time need not always agree across observers. Reality, whatever it may be, escapes the confines of space-time. So this basically goes into, things like emergent space-time and black holes, and he talks about from quantum theory that basically that there is no reality outside of observers. So he argues that basically, since non-contextual realism has been falsified, which it has through the Cauchy-Spector theorem, that basically that reality does not exist unless there is some context by which there's an observer to make a measurement. And this applies not just to, this is not just some, this is not just a debate among different interpretations of quantum mechanics, but this has to be the case for every interpretation of quantum mechanics. So even if you were to accept, let's say, like the many worlds view, you would still have to accept the fact that an observation depends on the context by which a measurement is happening, basically. So basically, the idea here is that since non-contextual realism has been falsified, then basically there's really no way you can really say that there is an objective reality, at least not an objective physical reality outside of perception. So that's basically what the implication is. Again, you can read the book to kind of get his larger arguments. I'm not going to go really into it. But basically, since non-contextual realism is false, then therefore it's more likely to be the case that that there is no physical objective reality out there, so to speak. So yeah. Again, we can kind of talk about all that stuff, but whatever. And then he says, hold on, let me see if I can get evolutionary. Okay. Okay, so he says, quote, evolutionary theory, as we have discussed, assumes the objective reality of objects such as DNA in organisms. It is not obvious that the acid of universal Darwinism in the form of the fitness beats truth theorem dissolves this extraneous assumption and reveals that more or less accurate symbolic representations of the external reality are never more fit than representations that hide external reality and a code's fitness payoff. So basically the idea is things like DNA and, again, physical objects, DNA and organisms are basically just representations for fitness. That's all it is. Again, this kind of goes back to the whole idea that, that kind of objective reality or physical reality as we perceive it doesn't really exist. It's actually just a fitness payoff to help us survive. So basically this goes back to his idea of that there is no objective physical reality, that it's all just conscious agents. Now, he also talks about, he actually accepts what's called quantum Bayesianism, and we've discussed this before in my previous videos. Basically, the idea is that quantum states describe not the objective world, but the beliefs of agents about consequences of their actions. Different agents may entertain different beliefs. No quantum state is universally true. Each is personal. My quantum state describes the consequences for me, my actions upon physical system. And so he kind of goes into how it's all about me, or whatever. So he says that quantum Bayesianism basically accepts that my perceptions of space, time, and objects are an interference shaped by natural selection, not to reveal reality, but to guide my actions in a way that enhance my fitness. Or my fitness, or, whatever subjective fitness that you see. So this basically supports the notion, again, that objective physical reality, or I should say physical reality, even though it's not objective, physical reality only exists because of fitness. It doesn't actually represent the true nature of the world. So that kind of went over a lot here, so I'm going to kind of skip now to, after he talks about physics and all that stuff, he talks about how exactly is it that we actually perceive, okay, if space and time are not fundamental, right, then what are the implications? Well, the implication is that if space and time are not fundamental, then that means physical things such as neurons or brains, they're not the fundamental reality. And if they're not the fundamental reality, well, then they can't produce consciousness. And if that's the case, well, then, that doesn't make any sense under physicalism, right? Because under physicalism, you have to kind of assume that physical objects in space-time are fundamental, because if the brain exists there, then it has to produce this thing we call consciousness. Well, if space and time are not fundamental, if they're if they're literally just a useful fiction to help us survive, if they're just literally there just for our fitness, then that means that neurons, physical objects, have no causal powers, at all. Neurons and brains and all that stuff, they have no causal powers at all. They're basically a useful fiction. And if that's the case, well, then they can't cause consciousness. And so this is kind of where it gets really interesting, because he talks about how if this is true, then obviously consciousness can't possibly be emergent from the brain. It can't possibly even be strongly emergent from the brain. And so it has to be more fundamental, not just more fundamental than the brain, but also more fundamental than space-time itself. And so this is kind of, if you go to chapter 7, he talks about how exactly does perception work. I'm not going to get into too much detail about it. And so this is basically the precise claim that he makes. He says, quote, "Any symmetry in our perceptions entails a corresponding symmetry in objective reality." Now, is this claim true? Here, we don't need hunches, we need a theorem, and we have one. The invention of symmetry theorem, which I conjectured, and I can't say his name, but revealed in this claim is false. So basically, the claim I just make is false. So this theorem states that symmetries in our perceptions entail nothing about the structure of objective reality. The proof is constructive. It shows precisely how perceptions and actions can enjoy a symmetry, such as translation, rotation, mirror, and Lorentzian, in a way that lacks any symmetry. So basically, again, the idea is that what we perceive is not objective reality, but rather it's just used for fitness. So now what's funny is that he also mentioned how most vision scientists, or most people that study vision, assume that what we see is objective reality, when in fact this is actually not the case. And so basically, if that's true, then any theory of consciousness which starts with neurons and starts with space-time is false. Any theory you come up with that tries to start with neurons and start with space-time is false if space-time itself is not fundamental to reality, which it's not fundamental to reality. So yeah, if that's the case, then physicalism is obviously not true under that circumstance. So he says also, quote, "ITPT, or the interference theory of perception, disagrees with the claim of standard and embodied theories that perception is vertical, but it agrees that perception and actions are closely linked. Our perceptions evolved to guide adaptive exploration and action. My icon of an apple guides my choice on whether to eat, as well as the grasping and biting actions of which I eat. My icon of poison ivy guides my action or my choice not to eat, as well as the steps I take to avoid any contact." And he also says, quote, "ITPP, or interference theory of perception, makes a counterintuitive claim about causality. The appearance of casual interactions between physical objects in space-time is a fiction. A useful fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. I see a cue ball hit an 8 ball into a corner pocket. I assume naturally that the cue ball caused the 8th ball to, hit the corner. But strictly speaking, I am wrong. Space-time is simply a species-specific desktop, and the physical objects are icons on the desktop. Or, as we have just been discussing, space-time is a communication channel, and physical objects are messages about fitness. And so this kind of goes into, again, the whole idea that physical space-time itself is simply just about fitness. It's not about reality. So I think I kind of went over the basic main ideas. And then his other stuff goes into more about perception and how all that works. I'm not going to get into details. So I think we pretty much get the full idea of what he's trying to get at here in his book. And again, this is very, very interesting about how he talks about it. But what I found most interesting, I think, was near the end, which I'm going to go over in a moment. But before we get there, here's the thing: is this type of stuff? He actually, kind of looking back now, the basic idea is that he uses evolutionary theory, and then he also used quantum mechanics to show that both quantum mechanics shows us that physical things are in a superposition of possible states when we're not looking. Like, we need an observer, and that's kind of the whole issue of contextuality, right? That we need an observer. Like, any experiment we do it depends on the context of the experiment, right? So that's what quantum mechanics reveals. And then you have evolution, which reveals that we don't actually perceive objective reality. Rather, what we perceive is fitness. What we perceive is fitness in order to help us survive in objective reality. And so space-time, again, is a fiction. It doesn't really exist in objective reality. It's just a fitness that we perceive to help us survive in the world. So that's basically the whole idea of the book. You could actually call it what's called an eliminative idealism, where, like, literally physical things do not exist at all. They only exist insofar as they help us to survive, and that is it. And again, that has very counterintuitive implications, but that is basically the idea behind an eliminativist idealism, where matter literally does not exist. It only exists to help us survive. It only exists for fitness. So that's basically the idea. So now I'm going to go into the last idea in his book, which I found very fascinating, honestly. So he says, quote, "Science is not an ontology. It is not committed to a space-time and objects that exist before any first-person experiences, and that must be studied by a third-person stance. Science is a method. It can test and discard ontologies. If our perceptions evolved by natural selection, then according to the fitness-beats truth theorem, we should discard the ontology of physicalism. We should recognize that space-time and objects are the perceptual interface used by humans. They are our first-person experiences. The scientific study of physical objects in space-time, even when conducted by large teams of scientists using advanced technologies, is necessarily a study of first-person experiences. The moon I see is an icon of my interference, and the moon you see is an icon of your interference. There is no objective moon or space-time that exists even when unperceived, and that must therefore be examined from a third-person point of view. There are only first-person observations. They do not exclude science. They are only the data science can never have. Science compares first-person observations to see if they agree." And so basically the idea is that, yes, we do share an objective reality, but this objective reality, once again, is not physical space-time itself. It's basically, his theory is that it's conscious agents that encompassing that is the objective reality, is basically space-time or conscious agents. So now and then finally, I'm not going to quote any more of the book because I think people should just read the book themselves, see what they think. Basically, he talks about near the end how that this could actually really help for scientists to come up with theories of God, right? Because if you're invoking conscious agents into your theory, then the question is, well, is there an infinite conscious agent, or is there a universal conscious agent that encompasses, all of reality? And that's really getting into, what's called this scientific theology, or this theology of science, or whatever. But basically, the idea is that science can actually give us insight into, theological concepts like God or whatever. And it's very fascinating how he goes into that in his book. He doesn't get into much detail, but he does talk about how with this theory, it can, at least in principle, help us to come up with a scientific theory of God, at least in the very precise mathematical sense. And so, that's pretty much it, guys, for the book itself. But I think these type of books, I was really I kind of underestimated at first what the book was going to be about. I knew he was going to talk about conscious agents. I didn't know that he would give such a good case for literally space-time not existing, or at least not existing in objective reality. And so yeah. So to kind of summarize the book itself, so he basically argued that physicalism has a problem, and the problem is that it can't explain consciousness, that there is no theory in neuroscience that can give us laws that can describe why is it that this specific brain process causes this conscious experience, or what differentiates what's the difference between different brain functions and different conscious experiences. So there is no theory in science that explains that. So that poses the problem. That's called the hard problem of consciousness. And then he gets into theories of perception and how maybe the problem isn't that we haven't found the solution yet. Maybe the problem is that we're looking at it the wrong way. Maybe the problem is that we're assuming that space-time and physical objects and the neurons in the brain are the fundamental reality, and that consciousness emerges from that. What if consciousness is fundamental, and then we get all the physical reality from consciousness? And that's basically his theory of conscious agents, and that physical space-time itself, what we perceive, is actually just a user interface for our fitness to help us survive in the world. And the objective reality, again, is not physical objects, because that's just fitness, but rather objective reality is these conscious agents or consciousness that exist beyond space-time, that kind of created created the appearance of physical reality. And that's the objective reality. That the objective reality is conscious agents, consciousness, or conscious agents that exist, and they interact, and they have complex networks that will create different different conscious experiences. So that's basically the idea behind what he's trying to argue. And that's why the book is called The Case Against Reality. It's not arguing against an objective reality. What it's arguing against is the notion of an objective physical reality. And so yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. But again, I think if you're an idealist, you should definitely get the book. And then if you're a physicalist and if you want to kind of challenge your own views, I think you should also get the book and read it and see how it is. And honestly, for me personally, I was really surprised, even as an idealist, the arguments he brought. And, he actually brought in a new argument, which was the argument from evolution regarding how our perceptions of the world can't really make any sense without looking at it from an idealist perspective, or the perspective of, if science tells us that space-time is not fundamental, then how do we make sense of this with, our perceptions? And I think perhaps Donald Hoffman is right to say that our perceptions are just a user interface. And so yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. But thank you guys for watching. I know this is kind of a little different than what I usually do. Hopefully, if every few months I might do book reviews like this to kind of go over the book and then give my thoughts on each paragraph or each chapter or whatever. But hopefully, I hope you all learned a lot, and again, just kind of get the book. And thank you guys for listening. If you haven't. But yeah, I'll see you guys next week and talk to you later.